Hello, and thank you for viewing this case study presentation of the fictional Rogers family for HUSE410, Dynamics of Interpersonal Communication, Dr. Dan Rotach, instructor. Presenting students are Shawna Orwoll, me, 2021 candidate for Human Services at Bethel University, and Bethany Preston, 2021 candidate for Christian Ministries at Bethel University. In this presentation, we will be doing an overview of the Rogers family, a fictional family comprised of father, mother, daughter, and son, both teenagers. We will review the presentation of the case study. We'll discuss family dynamics, spiritual observations, therapeutic observations, questions that we would consider asking the family and the clients should the therapeutic relationship continue. We'll move into the second portion of our presentation for team collaboration. We'll discuss the timeline in preparing for this presentation, as well as our individual contributions and our collaboration. And finally, we will review what we learned from this presentation and the observations that we had for both the case study as well as the communication process as teammates.
Okay, so the Rogers family case study is presented to clinical therapist, which would be our role, and we are presented with Mr. and Mrs. Rogers, who are parents to a 17-year-old daughter, as well as a son in college. The daughter is displaying concerning behavior that they're calling rebellious. They were encouraged by their pastor to seek professional counseling, but it was important that their counselor be a Christian. Although it becomes apparent that Mr. Rogers is only there because of the pastor's recommendation, not because he wants to be. And the parents are very reluctant to discuss any topic besides their rebellious daughter. Mr. Rogers does most of the talking, and he reacts very negatively when any mention or questions about their marriage, just basic questions, are asked. And he equates all those questions as to being sexual in nature. And Mrs. Rogers seems burdened by what she calls the sins of generations and is rather emotional. And they state that they are unable to continue counseling financially beyond 1 or 2 sessions, and so they would like their issues with their daughter resolved in that time.
This slide will be an overview of Rogers' family dynamics. We'll begin with Mr. Rogers. He is the father, the patriarch of the family. His behavior during our session displayed some possible authoritarian communication styles. He's quick to blame his spouse for real and perceived parenting limitations, very quick to place blame. I would say that the communication style for both Mr. Rogers and Mrs. Rogers is active, destructive, and they also have what I would call a parentarchy. Both of them, both parents share responsibility for raising the children in different ways. The father, more of, seems more of a spiritual aspect, and the mother more of the disciplinarian. Mr. Rogers places a high level of responsibility upon Mrs. Rogers to have raised their daughter correctly, so he states. He also, as Bethany mentioned earlier, he speaks on behalf of his spouse. Of note is that Mrs. Rogers did contact us to set the appointment, and it's Mr. Rogers who participated primarily in answering the questions before his wife could do so. And again, very unwilling to discuss any aspect of their marriage, whether it is from the mundane, tell me how long you've been married, to anything related to sexual issues. There does seem to be a high regard for purity culture within the Rogers family, specifically for Mr. Rogers. And one of the presenting concerns is that Their daughter did attend a purity ball with Mr. Rogers, but refused to participate. The daughter did reluctantly go to the ball, but she did not dance or sign any sort of purity pledge, and Mr. Rogers expressed a great level of disappointment in that. Mrs. Rogers, as Bethany earlier stated, she's emotional and she seems to be burdened with a lot of blame and guilt, specifically shame. Looking at that from the perspective of Judy Rotach, licensed professional clinical counselor, who presented in our lecture regarding the vulnerability and shame, Mrs. Rogers displays those characteristics of someone who is living with a deep trauma that they have internalized and that it presents as shame. We suspect that that stems from the trauma of pregnancy before marriage, the impact of that pregnancy on the family, or on Mr. and Mrs. Rogers' relationship is as of yet unknown. We're assuming, because we do know that the couple was engaged at the time of the pregnancy, we don't know if they moved forward with the marriage because they do love each other, they were engaged, or if they moved forward with the marriage because, well, they're pregnant and that's the right thing to do. We're not certain the longevity of the conflict within the marriage yet. And so we need to further explore that. There's definitely a disconnect in communication as well as intimacy on many different levels. I would say that there is limited mutuality and a lot of emotional dysregulation, especially on the part of Mrs. Rogers. While Mr. Rogers does communicate in an aggressive manner, and I would say almost belligerent at times. So there is emotion behind that, but his emotion expresses anger. Mrs. Rogers expresses sadness and shame over the guilt. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers share two children, their son, who is 19. He is living outside of the home and he is attending a Christian college. It seems as though the son is currently towing the line. There are no concerns for the son, or no concerns about the son's behavior, or past or present, on behalf of Mr. and Mrs. Rogers. Their primary presenting issue is that their daughter, who is 17, has been displaying some rebellious or concerning behavior over the past 3 years. It is of note that Mr. Rogers is the one or Mr. Rogers is the client that describes their daughter as rebellious. Mrs. Rogers did not. And it also is important to note that the daughter has a history of cutting. It is unclear if Mr. Rogers intervened in that at all, but as we know now, as of what we know now, Mrs. Rogers is the one who addressed that with her daughter, who was reticent to discuss. We don't know if the cutting behavior continued, but it does seem that the drastic change in the daughter's behavior, going from what Mr. Rogers perceives as immodest dressing and wearing yoga pants with other friends who dress that way, seems to be the root or causality of the beginning of the problems. But it seems that the daughter may have experienced some trauma that caused her to begin cutting and also generally withdraw from the family.
I'm going to cover just some of the spiritual sides of our observations, starting with Mrs. Rogers. She seems to, as Shawna said, be carrying spiritual guilt and possible trauma from her self-proclaimed sin of sex before marriage. And she is the one who shared that, not Mr. Rogers, and she definitely took the blame for that, which would be something to approach with them because it seems to be presenting as though it is her sin and Mr. Rogers is not taking any sort of responsibility for it. As well, in the questioning would be if she views the pregnancy itself as a sin or just the sexual behavior that led to the pregnancy. From a spiritual point of view, that's important that she has possibly put a burden on her daughter that she herself is sinful because of that, which would be incorrect on many theological standpoints. And so there could be what she herself is referring to as generational sins, but something that she has projected onto her daughter as well. They did not share their daughter's knowledge in that as it was presented at the end of the session. And as discussed, she is very full of shame. It has a strong hold on her, and this could be keeping her from a good connection with her husband and with her daughter, or even her son as well. And this as well could be a possibility of why she is not expressing her views and opinions in the session, why Mr. Rogers is doing most of the talking. If she is full of shame, it's going to be even harder when her spouse is the one who is putting responsibility for their daughter on her. And we would as well discuss that research showing that the parents are the key to the spiritual formation in their kids. There's been quite a lot of formation research about this, but that would include working with Mr. Rogers on his understanding of his role as a father, not just in an authoritarian position or a legalistic position to protect her purity from her immodest dress, as he seems to project, but as well working on his role and relationship with her, not just from a spiritual standpoint, but for what would be best for her. He seems to approach his daughter more as her reflection on him versus actual concern for her welfare, which would also indicate that they are part of a common groupthink problem among many Christian families, which is that they have pressure to produce Christian children, which is not biblical. It is not a command given that you must make sure your children are saved. There's many scriptures to back up that it is a choice to be made, that you must believe on Christ and that your behavior would be an indication of that, not just the parenting. So their daughter shows, as Shawna mentioned, the focus on sexual purity and purity culture. She shows signs of spiritual trauma from that, which is a very newly studied but well-known thing, and that her sexuality seems to be a very important topic between Mr. and Mrs. Rogers and their daughter. And it is quite possible this has done some trauma to her and put on responsibility on her that that's the most important thing that she could do, which would easily indicate why she pushed back against a purity ball and signing a pledge, which is somewhat positive that she's showing that pushback and not just submitting to whatever her dad wanted. But it does definitely indicate a deeper problem within their family and even their church culture. Her history of cutting and withdrawal definitely indicates deeper spiritual bondage and could indicate deeper trauma and depression. That is the reason for the cutting. Cutting is not just a physical traumatic psychological response, but also invites in spiritual bondage that would need to be addressed as well in inner spiritual healing, taking back the authority that she's given in the cutting and the hatred of her body, as well as she would benefit from continued emotional and behavior therapy, and just providing Mr. and Mrs. Rogers materials overall about emotional intelligence, and trying to teach them that from a spiritual point of view, not everything comes down to an exact command in the Bible, but that we have a lot of knowledge given to us by God, who instilled a brain in us to learn about emotions and the value of acknowledging their daughter's emotions and the benefit that they can see as seeing her as a person and the issues that she is having versus is just a reflection on themselves, which is only causing further spiritual trauma. So Now Shawna is going to address just some of the therapeutic recommendations and observations.
Please note that at the top of this slide, F is father, M is mother, D daughter, S son. So with the therapist observation for those of us in this class who are considering pursuing a future career role as a therapist, I created therapist notes using the data, the data application and the DAT process for therapist notes. So we look at the, for the data, the clients appeared reluctant to therapy. As we mentioned before, the father was aggressive and critical with communication. He was interrupting, speaking on behalf of the mother, and also some anger issues when the relationship, his marriage was questioned. The mother was anxious and tearful, and she expressed guilt for her daughter's behavior, which was also corroborated by the father's blame. So within this DAT process of post-session notes, it would be data assessment and plan. This would be the data column. We'll move into the assessment of what we feel is the overall, some overarching issues that we observed with the couple. And we do see that the mother and father are discordant in communication and approach to parenting. The father feels that the daughter is rebellious, the mother does not. The mother displays a depressed mood and some anxiety. And I mentioned earlier that the father seemed agitated and a bit aggressive in his communication. His anger could also signify some depression in him. For the therapeutic plan, our plan would be to schedule the next couple session, followed by potentially individual sessions, each with the mother and father, to not only assess the disconnect, but also try to key in to see if there is any sort of abuse going on within the marriage that needs to be addressed. We will look at conflict resolution and communication, listening skills, and probably take the cognitive behavioral approach. It is our recommendation that the daughter seeks therapy with a child trauma therapist. And Bethany had a strong insight that the family should continue spiritual mentorship and continue working with their pastor, as well as working with a professional therapist. We may look at a sliding scale for the couple for fees if their insurance does not continue to pay. There are a lot of aspects to this case, not only from a family perspective, but also from each individual who really needs to be heard and seen. It's possible that the family has been operating out of status quo for a long time, and the daughter's behavioral outcry has kind of interrupted and tipped over that apple cart, so to speak. From a therapeutic perspective in the DSM-5, my tentative diagnosis would be F493, stress not otherwise specified. Both parents are exhibiting stress. It may be that ultimately we would find that the mother or father also display evidence of post-traumatic stress disorder. The mother specifically with the pregnancy before marriage, and really our focus will be to understand how that, as Bethany stated earlier, is the sins of her generation due to the pregnancy or the sex before marriage. What actually is the burden of shame for Mrs. Rogers? So we'll want to dig in deeper to that to try to understand the community response, and also the individual response. From what we have observed thus far with the Rogers family, Mr. Rogers is quick to place blame upon Mrs. Rogers for real or perceived shortcomings, and we are wondering if that is something that has been a pattern in their relationship from the beginning. So how did Mr. Rogers work through the pregnancy, or was it all did it all happen at the blame of Mrs. Rogers?
So questions that we would have for the clients, if as we hope that they would choose to continue therapy, we would definitely address the area of parenting. This would help offset Mr. Rogers' concern that we focus on their daughter, and hopefully alleviate just some of those barriers and walls that he has put up of not wanting to discuss his own life. And so we would ask them to define their expectations of each other's role in parenting and their own role. And this would definitely reveal a lot about Mr. Rogers' expectations of his wife's role with their daughter. And it would hopefully allow his wife to have a voice of what she would view her own role as, and then as well what she would hope that his role would be, and hopefully open some communication for them. And then as well have both of them define exactly what they consider to be rebellion, or what Mr. Rogers labels as rebellion. And it was very hard to get an opinion from Mrs. Rogers, just what she saw in their daughter because of Mr. Rogers overspeaking. And so it would allow an opportunity for her to share insights that she may have, just even from conversations or just her own insight. And then as well, if their daughter is open to any pastoral care or therapy, and have they practiced any interventions over the years of these issues surfacing? Has it been only in their parenting? Has it been as they approached their pastor? Has she had any interventions, whether it be in youth group or among friends or other people in the church? And then we really do want to address from a faith standpoint what their biblical basis is for the issues they're defining as rebellion. And that would definitely put some focus on the purity culture issue, as Mr. Rogers is viewing yoga pants as immodest, and just what his basis is for that, as they give high respect, at least Mr. Rogers does, to Christianity and to their church and to biblical basis. And so being able to help him think through some of those issues from a biblical perspective may open him to digging into them more and what his thinking is in that. And then just, are they open to having their daughter attend counseling on her own? As Shawna said, we would recommend that she receive counseling from a very specified child therapist who is highly trained in a lot of the issues that she is presenting. And then on the spiritual and religion side of questions for them, trying to ask how faith is expressed in the marriage. And again, looking at the positions that Mr. Rogers has presented as being defensive about their marriage. So hopefully starting to address it from just a spiritual standpoint, and how faith is expressed will again open the door for him to be willing to share more and not to feel on the defensive. And so how is faith expressed in their parenting? Is it all authoritarian and legalistic and following a certain line, or is it based on relationships with God and their love for God and his love for them? And what do they actually know of their children's faith journey? They present their son as having no issues. He is safely at a Christian college, but they do not share in depth about his personal faith. And so that would be a question to explore as well, if he is just doing, as Shawna mentioned earlier, what is right and towing the line, or if he has his own faith as well. And then just what role they think their daughter has in her own faith journey. That is she just listening and hearing and understanding, or is she actually moved into believing and obeying herself? And where does that responsibility lie? As we talked about, if they're carrying a burden that their daughter present as a Christian because they are Christians, or if they are genuinely concerned for her heart and her salvation and her life. And then also asking, like, the belief of why their pastor referred them to the counseling with us as licensed clinical counselors, that would indicate that he sees a deeper issue beyond just the moral rebellion behavior that Mr. Rogers listed, and realize that they could benefit from clinical counseling, which is what Shawna is going to address now.
Thank you, Bethany. So within the, we feel that it is definitely important to get a baseline of history for each couple, or each of the Rogerses, and hopefully ultimately the children, if we proceed with family counseling for the entire family. We would want to get a history perspective. We'll look at the client family of origin, as well as Mr. and Mrs. Rogers' marriage. We would like for each of them to describe their relationship with each other as they understand it today, not specifically from what they're expected to say about marriage, what their church believes about marriage, as Bethany has really articulated very well. But we'd like to understand how each of them are approaching their marriage, and if they're active participants in it. Another aspect is that we'd like to look at how their relationship has changed since they married. Of course, we do know that every relationship goes through peaks and valleys throughout the marriage, but throughout the course of Mr. and Mrs. Rogers being married, has it been more valleys than peaks? And what do they, it'll be interesting to determine what reasons they give for whether there are more good times than bad times, or vice versa. So we'll look at how the relationship has changed, definitely from a perspective of spirituality, but also sexuality, communication, conflict, and maybe some other areas of conflict outside of the concerns for their child that might be hindering them from having a healthy marriage. We also wanted to look at, again, going back to the situation of generational sin and the pregnancy before marriage. Even though Mr. and Mrs. Rogers were engaged at the time of the pregnancy, we'd like to understand if they both were willing and active participants in deciding to get married, or if that was a community or familial expectation, so as not to bring shame to their individual families, much in the way that Bethany has expressed earlier, they may be experiencing with their daughter, where her perceived immodesty or possible lack of purity, so to speak, might be bringing shame upon the family. And then also, again, just how they each viewed the unplanned pregnancy, and took responsibility for it. And then finally, having each parent describe their families of origin. We'll look at families of origin from examples of parenting, examples of affection expressed in the home, communication, and how they interacted with their parents, and how that may have influenced them as parents to their own children today.
We're going to move into our team collaboration and how we approach this assignment, how we work together, and Shawna is going to start that off with us with a timeline of our meeting and collaboration.
So we started by creating the outline of our slides, our team slides, trying to understand what, how we were going to organize the information and approach it. So we began that process on 12/29. On 12/30, we had our first Zoom meeting to review the case. Much of that meeting was to discuss the case specifically and our shared concerns and observations for this fictional family. We also created some action items for our next meeting, and just a commitment to continue to review the case notes and seek out references and research to support what our what our observations for this case are. We met again on the 31st of January to review the project status and began drafting the slides. On 2/1, we met again to review the final draft, do a run through, and we scheduled our recording. And then today our timeline ends with the completion of the project recording and submitting the assignment.
So each of our contributions and our collaboration, Shawna did a great job of drafting the slides for the presentation, and she was very on top of scheduling our meetings, which was just a mutual respect of each other's time and understanding when things come in the way. And she researched the case from the mental health perspective and did a wonderful job with that. And she is behind finalizing the video for publishing and submission. I researched spiritual aspects of family trauma, spiritual groupthink, religious parenting, and the spiritual trauma of the purity culture. I got to edit the slides for content and grammar, and together we edited together our final presentation and really collaborated regarding our research and sharing that with each other and the application to the HUSE410 modules and how the things that we have learned throughout this course applied to this case study and deepened our thinking and helped our approach in knowing what we should actually research and what was going to be most beneficial with the presenting problems. And we really, I feel, worked together well as a team in just knowing our strengths and playing to them and encouraging each other along the way and having respect for our thoughts and our just mutual viewpoints. And as Shawna so well put, that we were able to address it from each of our strengths and just in this case study, in correlation with resources and learning from HUSE410, we provide an environment for teamwork that utilized both of our strengths and revealed opportunities for both of us. We were well suited to the project due to our shared communication styles, definitely our work ethic as students, and our approach to having a well-rounded case study.
Thank you to our classmates. Thank you to Dr. Rhoda and Bethany. Thank you to you for collaborating on this project. Should you have questions regarding our case study, we've provided our email addresses for you, and we welcome any feedback, insights, or further questions so that we can continue to learn from this project and from this class. Our references are noted on these 2 slides. Again, thank you very much for joining us, and good luck in the rest of your studies.